December 1974. A Japanese soldier emerges from the jungle, still in his Imperial Army uniform, still fighting World War II. The war had been over for 29 years. Nixon had resigned. Man had walked on the moon. The Beatles had broken up. But this soldier didn't know any of that. He thought he was still at war. And when the truth is revealed, his reaction will break your heart. March 1974. A young Japanese adventurer named Norio Suzuki is trekking through the dense jungles of Lubang Island in the Philippines. He's on what most people would consider a ridiculous quest. He told his friends back in Tokyo that he was searching for 3 things in this exact order: Lieutenant Hiroo Onoda, a panda, and the abominable snowman. Most people laughed, but Suzuki wasn't joking. 4 days into his search, something impossible happens. He spots a figure moving through the trees. The figure is wearing a tattered Imperial Japanese Army uniform. The man is thin, weathered, carrying a rifle that's nearly 3 decades old, but still perfectly maintained. Suzuki approaches carefully. "Lieutenant Onoda!" he calls out. The soldier freezes. For the first time in nearly 30 years, Hiroo Onoda is face to face with another Japanese person. What happens next will captivate the world, because Lieutenant Onoda is about to reveal that he's been fighting World War II for 29 years after everyone else stopped. And the reason why will force us to confront uncomfortable questions about duty, honor, and the cost of absolute obedience. Let's go back to the beginning. December 26, 1944. The Philippines. The American forces are closing in on Japan's empire. Every island matters now. Every delay gives the Japanese homeland more time to prepare for the inevitable invasion. 22-year-old 2nd Lieutenant Hiroo Onoda has just arrived on Lubang Island, a small strategic outpost 93 miles southwest of Manila. He's been trained at the Nakano School, Japan's elite intelligence academy. He knows guerrilla warfare, sabotage, survival. He's the perfect man for an impossible mission. His commanding officer, Major Yoshimi Taniguchi, gives him his final orders. They're simple but absolute. You are to conduct guerrilla warfare, destroy the airstrip, harass the enemy. Whatever happens, you are absolutely forbidden to die by your own hand. It may take 3 years, it may take 5, but whatever happens will come back for you. Until then, so long as you have one soldier, you are to continue to lead him. Onoda salutes. He understands. This isn't a suicide mission, this is a holding action. Stay alive, tie down enemy resources, wait for the Japanese army to return. 3 other soldiers are with him: Private Yuichi Akatsu, Corporal Shoichi Shimada, and Private First Class Kinshichi Kozuka. Together, they retreat into the jungle as American forces land on the island. Days turn into weeks, weeks turn into months. August 15, 1945. Emperor Hirohito's voice crackles over radios across Japan and its remaining territories. The war is over. Japan surrenders unconditionally. But Onoda and his men don't hear this broadcast. They're deep in the jungle, living in caves, surviving on coconuts, bananas, and whatever they can steal from local farms. And then the leaflets start falling from the sky. American planes drop thousands of pamphlets over Lubang Island. The message is clear. The war is over. Surrender. You will not be harmed. Onoda reads one of these leaflets. He studies it carefully. Then he does something that will define the next 30 years of his life. He decides it's enemy propaganda. Think about this decision for a moment. Onoda has been trained to be suspicious of everything. He knows the Americans use psychological warfare. He knows they'll say anything to get Japanese soldiers to surrender. And Major Taneguchi's orders were absolute: continue fighting until the Imperial Army returns. So Onoda burns the leaflet and continues his mission. More leaflets fall. These ones are in better Japanese. They have photographs of Japanese officials signing surrender documents. They have messages from family members. Onoda's family even drops letters specifically for him, begging him to come home. He doesn't believe them. The Americans could have forced his family to write those letters. The photographs could be faked. This is psychological warfare, pure and simple. Private Akadzu can't take it anymore. 5 years in the jungle, 5 years of constant vigilance, terrible food, no contact with civilization. He slips away one night and surrenders to Filipino forces. Onoda is disappointed but not surprised. Akatsu was always the weak one. Now, there are 3. Search parties from Japan arrive on Lubang Island. They're not military, they're families of the holdouts. Onoda's own brother is among them. They call out into the jungle, begging the soldiers to come home. Onoda hears his brother's voice. He recognizes it, but he doesn't respond. Because if he can recognize his brother's voice, so can the enemy. They could have captured his brother, forced him to make these calls. It's a trap. It has to be a trap. The search parties leave empty-handed. Corporal Shimada is killed in a shootout with a Philippine military patrol. Onoda and Kozuka barely escape. Now, there are 2. The years continue to pass. Onoda and Kozuka develop an efficient routine. They raid local farms for rice, which they burn as a signal to any passing Japanese forces that they're still alive and operational. They maintain their weapons meticulously. They conduct reconnaissance. They wait. Meanwhile, the world moves on. In Japan, the devastation of war gives way to economic miracle. Cities are rebuilt. Democracy flourishes. Japan becomes one of the richest nations on earth. In the Philippines, independence is won, governments rise and fall, and Lubang Island's inhabitants live in constant low-level fear of the 2 Japanese soldiers who occasionally raid their farms and sometimes shoot at people they perceive as threats. Onoda and Kozuka find a newspaper from 1959. It's too recent to be fake propaganda. The Americans wouldn't waste resources making fake newspapers a decade after the war. They read about Japan's incredible economic growth, about the 1964 Tokyo Olympics, about color television and bullet trains and rock and roll music. For a moment, just a moment, Onoda wonders if maybe, just maybe, the war really is over. Then he remembers his orders. Major Taneguchi said it might take 3 years or 5. Well, it's been 15 now. But the orders were clear: fight until the Imperial Army returns. Not until you think the war is over. Until they come back for you. So, Onoda folds up the newspaper and continues his mission. October 19. Kozuka is killed in a shootout with local police during one of their rice-burning raids. He's shot multiple times. Onoda escapes into the jungle, alone. For the first time in 27 years, Hiro Onoda is completely alone. He's 50 years old now. He spent more than half his life in this jungle. Most of his teeth are gone. His uniform is held together with patches and plant fiber, but his rifle still works. His mission continues. Back in Japan, Kozuka's death makes headlines. If Kozuka was alive until 1972, could Onoda still be alive too? The media speculates. Families grieve. The Japanese government officially declares Onoda dead. But one young man named Norio Suzuki doesn't believe it. This hippie adventurer decides he's going to find Onoda. His friends think he's crazy. But in February 1974, Suzuki travels to Lubang Island and begins his search. 4 days later, he finds him. Their first meeting is surreal. Suzuki, with his long hair and modern clothes, represents everything that's changed in Japan. Onoda, in his rotting 1944 uniform, represents everything that stayed the same. They talk. Suzuki explains that the war is over for 29 years. He shows Onoda newspapers, photographs, proof. And here's the heartbreaking part. Onoda believes him. For the first time in 3 decades, Onoda accepts that World War II is over. Japan lost. The emperor survived. The country has moved on. But Onoda doesn't surrender, not to Suzuki, not to the Philippine government, not to anyone except Major Taniguchi, his commanding officer. I was given an order, Onoda tells Suzuki. Only the man who gave me that order can relieve me of it. Suzuki returns to Japan with photographs proving Onoda is alive. The Japanese government locates Major Taniguchi, who's now a bookseller in his 50s. They ask him to travel to the Philippines. Taniguchi agrees. March 9th, 1974. Major Taniguchi, now middle-aged and wearing civilian clothes, stands in a clearing on Lubang Island. Onoda emerges from the jungle in full uniform, rifle slung over his shoulder. The two men salute each other. Then, Taniguchi reads an official order. Units and individuals under the command of Special Squadron Yom are to cease military activities and operations immediately and place themselves under the command of the nearest superior officer. When no officer can be found, they are to communicate with the American or Philippine forces and follow their directives. Only then does Onoda lower his rifle. March 10th, 1974. Lieutenant Hiro Onoda formally surrenders. He turns over his sword, his Arisaka Type 99 rifle, still functioning after 30 years, 500 rounds of ammunition, several hand grenades, and a dagger his mother gave him in 1944 to use if he was ever captured. The next day, a formal surrender ceremony is held at Malacañang Palace in Manila. Philippine President Ferdinand Marcos presides. International media captures every moment. Marcos grants Onoda a full pardon for any crimes committed while he believed the war was ongoing. The Filipino people are less forgiving. Over the years, Onoda and his men killed approximately 30 Filipino civilians. 30 people who died in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, casualties of a war that ended in 1945. When Onoda returns to Japan, he's greeted by 8,000 people. He's declared a national hero. He represents old values, duty, loyalty, sacrifice, that many Japanese feel have been lost in the rush to modernize. But Onoda himself feels lost. He spent 29 years preparing for a world that no longer exists. The Japan he returns to is unrecognizable. There's no emperor worship, no military pride, just corporations and capitalism and neon lights. In interviews, Onoda is asked what he thought about during those 29 years in the jungle. His answer is simple: nothing but accomplishing my duty. Duty. That word defines everything about Onoda's story. He wrote a memoir, No Surrender, My 30-Year War. It became a bestseller. But some questioned his account. Was it really possible he didn't know the war was over? Or did he know but choose to keep fighting anyway because surrendering would mean admitting he'd wasted his life? We'll never know for certain. Onoda himself gave conflicting accounts. Sometimes he insisted he truly believed the war continued. Other times he hinted that he knew but felt trapped by his orders and his pride. 1 year after returning to Japan, Onoda moved to Brazil. He couldn't adapt to modern Japanese society. He became a cattle rancher, married, and spent most of his remaining years far from the country he'd fought for. But in 1984, he returned to Japan and started a school teaching children survival skills and traditional values. He wanted to pass on what he'd learned, though in a very different context. Onoda died in 2014 at age 91. His death made international headlines. The last warrior of World War II was finally gone. But his story raises profound questions that go beyond one man's obsession with duty. What do we owe our countries? When does loyalty become fanaticism? When should we question our orders? Onoda followed his orders perfectly. Major Taniguchi told him to fight until the Imperial Army returned, and that's exactly what he did. In a military sense, he was the ideal soldier. But 30 Filipino civilians died because of his ideal behavior. People who had nothing to do with World War II, who were born after the war ended, who were killed by a man fighting a ghost war. Were Onoda's actions heroic or tragic? Admirable or horrifying? The answer is probably both. Onoda was a product of a specific time and ideology. He was trained to never question orders, to value duty above life itself, to see surrender as worse than death. These weren't his personal failings. They were the values of Imperial Japan's military culture. But he also had a choice. Every day for 29 years, he could have chosen to walk out of that jungle. Other Japanese holdouts did. Even his own men did. Onoda stayed. Was it because he genuinely believed, or because admitting the truth would mean accepting that he'd wasted 30 decades of his life for nothing? Near the end of his life, Onoda returned to Lubang Island one final time. He donated $10,000 to the local school. It was, perhaps, his way of apologizing for the terror he had caused. The local people accepted his donation, but didn't forgive him. How could they? How do you forgive someone who killed your relatives long after the war ended? Today, Hiro Onoda is remembered differently depending on who's telling the story. In Japan, he's often portrayed as the last samurai, a man who embodied pure loyalty and dedication. In the Philippines, he's remembered as a killer who terrorized an island for 30 years. The truth, as always, is more complex. Onoda was a 22-year-old soldier who received impossible orders and followed them with absolute dedication. He survived in one of the harshest environments imaginable through pure skill and willpower. He maintained his equipment, his discipline, and his mission for longer than most people maintain anything. But he also represents the danger of blind obedience, of following orders without question, of prioritizing abstract concepts like duty and honor over human life and common sense. When Major Taniguchi gave Onoda those final orders in 1944, he probably never imagined his subordinate would follow them for 30 years. He probably assumed Onoda would surrender when the war obviously ended, when the leaflets fell, when his family called for him. But Onoda took those orders literally, absolutely, tragically. And 30 people died because of it. The story of Hiro Onoda isn't just about one man in the jungle. It's about what happens when we create systems that demand absolute obedience. It's about the cost of never questioning authority. It's about the fine line between dedication and delusion. Lieutenant Hiro Onoda fought World War II for 39 years, 10 months, and 23 days after everyone else stopped. He was the second-to-last Japanese soldier to surrender. A Taiwanese soldier named Teruo Nakamura was found 9 months later, also hiding in the jungle. When Onoda finally did surrender, he wept uncontrollably. Not from relief, not from joy at being rescued, but from grief at letting down the emperor, at abandoning his post, at finally disobeying orders. That's the tragedy of Hiroo Onoda. He was so dedicated to his duty that he forgot why the duty existed in the first place. He became so focused on following orders that he lost sight of their purpose. In his final years, Onoda mellowed. He admitted doubts he'd never expressed before. He acknowledged the pain he'd caused. He tried, in his way, to make amends. But he never truly apologized, because to apologize would be to admit that his 29-year war was a mistake. And if it was a mistake, then what was it all for? That's a question Hiroo Onoda could never answer. A question that haunted him until his death. The man who fought World War II for 30 years teaches us something important. Blind loyalty, no matter how sincere, can lead to tragedy. Orders must be questioned. Duty must be balanced with reason. Honor must not come at the expense of humanity. Hiroo Onoda was a soldier, a dedicated one, perhaps too dedicated. And 30 years after the war ended, he finally learned what the rest of the world had discovered in 1945. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is surrender.